Hey, hey, hey! Welcome to my cozy corner of the internet. This is Nephilim VA bringing you the 5th chapter of our Painted Stages Fall Apart by Scenes, which is written by Silverheart SP on AO3. Everyone has been found except for Bakugo and Midoriya. But Midoriya's time is running out, so all we can hope is that they are found soon, before All Might rips his hair out. Let's find out after the trigger warnings, because this fanfiction is one emotional rollercoaster of a wump. This fanfiction is for general audiences with themes of fluff and angst, near-death experiences, and canon-typical violence. Also beware of slight manga spoilers. If that isn't your style, then I recommend a real James Bond type, which is written by Hybrid Empress on AO3. It can be found on my channel! Brace yourselves, everybody. Now I implore you to sit back and relax whilst I read to you. Chapter 5. Desperation's gonna take me all the way. Shota was up at 4:30 the next morning after a mere 4 hours of sleep, ready to be at the hospital by 5. He needed to fill out some paperwork pertaining to his admitted students. Then he would pay them all a visit to make sure they were doing okay. He also had a feeling he and the other staff would be called in again, and early at that, so he needed to organize a substitute to take his classes. He hadn't had any emails overnight, which meant Midoriya and Bakugo were still missing. It pained him to leave his other students for the day, but it pained him even more to not help look for his missing ones. He got dressed mechanically, his mind racing. He would need an energizing breakfast today. After that, he would head to the hospital immediately. He would make sure his phone was on the loudest ring volume possible. A sudden blaring tune cut into his thoughts. Think of it and it shall appear, thought Shota, picking up his phone. He didn't recognize the number, which could only mean one thing. Hello? Stated Shota sharply, pulling on a shoe. Yes, a race ahead? Came an unfamiliar voice. Speaking, replied Shota. This is Watanabe Yori, calling on behalf of Musatafu Search and Rescue. You have been requested to return to Musatafu Museum in order to aid the currently ongoing retrieval and rescue efforts. Shota kept listening, nodding along and adding affirmations when required. He was already out the door and down the hallway, on his way to the hospital, when the speaker made him stop short. In addition to professional aid from you, it is understood that you are the teacher of a heroics class at UA High School? Yes, said Shota slowly. He knew where this was going. The department has also requested aid from hero students around the city due to a shortage of professionals that are available. Your class has been identified as applicable to this scenario. The presence of your students has thus been requested to aid with the rescue efforts. Is this acceptable? Shota took in a breath. He wasn't a fan of the idea, particularly because they had personal stakes in the mission. But it wasn't that much different to work studies, he supposed. In fact, it was probably safer than work studies, and since this fell under emergency service requested by the government, parental permission would be bypassed. The students would be treated like actual pros. Yes, sighed Shota. My students will be there. When do you need us? As soon as possible, please. The overnight team will be finishing their shift in around an hour. Noted, said Shota. Thank you for your call. Please contact me again regarding any updates. They exchanged a few more minor details before Shota hung up. He stood in the hallway for a second. He had been about to go to the hospital, but now he would have to wake up his class to get them ready and brief them. He didn't know if he would have enough time to visit the hospital even. He would have to request for the paperwork to be emailed to him. Shota resumed his stride down the hallway, this time towards the student dorms, guilt and a mix of other things swirling in his chest. He really wanted to see his students in the hospital, and it was killing him that he wasn't going to be able to, but Midoriya and Bakugo were a better use of his time right now, and he knew his class would be happy that they were getting to help. Right, he couldn't afford to overthink this situation. He had a job to do. He gathered himself and slipped into his professional mindset. Shota observed indifferently as the last of his class straggled into the common room, mumbling with sleepiness and complaining about the time. It took a few seconds, but his class knew what he wanted. They quietened quickly. The more awake they were becoming, the more their expressions twisted to serious or worried. So they probably knew what to expect from being woken up so early. Once it was completely silent, Shota began. I'm sure you're all aware, but yesterday 6 of your classmates were caught up in a destructive villain attack at Musatafu Museum. Dead silence. Shota watched the faces before him. Uraraka attempted to remain impassive, but a slight tremble to her mouth betrayed her. Ashido, Sero, and Kaminari had shifted slightly closer together. Todoroki had a dangerous glint in his eye, his face ominously shadowed. Shota continued. 4 of them have been successfully recovered with minimal injuries. Yaoyorozu, Kirishima, Ida, and Sato are currently staying at the hospital and are likely to be discharged soon. At this, eyes were widening around the room. He heard several huffs of relief. Ashido broke into a wavering smile, and her 2 friends around her looked at each other with matching grins. Shota hated having to break it, but it was important. He continued. However, Midoriya and Bakugo are still missing. Shota's students' faces went through a strange process. The relief from before remained for a split second, but wavered into concern and fright, then a strange mix of the two as they couldn't decide how to feel. Uraraka's eyes were wide and shone with unshed tears. She looked like she was about to cry. With relief or concern, Shota couldn't tell. Sir, came an unexpected voice. Shota glanced over to find Todoroki looking thunderous and determined. He looked slightly less intense now that he knew most of his classmates were safe, but he remained just as adamant. Surely we'll be allowed to help to find them. Yesterday All Might said, "Let me finish," said Shota steadily. Todoroki stopped, but didn't look happy about it. Luckily for you, Todoroki, that's what I'll be addressing next. I was contacted by the Search and Rescue Department managing this case just earlier, and due to various shortages in heroes, your class has been requested to help on the rescue mission at the site. Now, before you get too excited... It was too late. The whole class had brightened considerably at that, and a new aura of hope began buzzing about them. Asui and Uraraka glanced at each other with slight excitement. Ashido, Sero, and Kaminari all looked more alert and upbeat, and Todoroki looked surprised. The rest of the class was muttering to one another, and Shota had to hold up a hand for silence. He waited for the buzz to die down, then continued. Listen carefully, he said. You are allowed to help, but you'll be helping as heroes, understood? The atmosphere turned serious again. There were nods all around. Shota stared at the class intently for another second, knowing it would help drill it in. That means a couple of things. Firstly, you are not helping to look for Midoriya and Bakugo. You are helping to look for survivors. Any survivors. If you find your classmates, it will be a bonus. Understood? More nods. Shota would have to reinstate that one a few more times, he could tell. Good, he said warningly, scanning the faces. Secondly, You will be on this mission as heroes and will be treated as heroes. It's the same as a work study. Anything that happens involving you will be your responsibility, and you are responsible for organizing yourselves and taking initiative to do what you think is best. The only thing the school will take responsibility for is transport of you to and from the site. Understood? This time the nods were more hesitant, and the expressions were more serious. Determined expressions had settled onto many of the students' faces. Thirdly, continued Shota, now fairly confident he was being listened to and taken seriously, there are several safety rules and laws that every hero goes through after they graduate. Shota explained all the relevant information to his class clearly and shortly, highlighting the important parts. It was likely they'd be with other classes from UA, namely the second years and possibly Class 1B. They were to be ready and in the foyer within half an hour. They would be missing classes for this. There would be time to catch up, and telling their parents was up to them. They would likely be working until the night shift began back up. There was a high possibility that they would see graphic injuries or dead bodies, even of Midoriya and Bakugo. The class absorbed the information like sponges, and it gradually became apparent to them how serious this was. This was an actual mission, and they would likely encounter something similar when they became pros. This involved real people, real villains, real authorities managing it, real victims. Their friends as victims. Shota took mercy on them, and provided the option to opt out. He would support his students against the department if they were uncomfortable. But to Shota's pride, perhaps, not one of them did. All of his students were going to do everything they could to help. He dismissed them quickly, aware of the time. Shota left to go and wait to take them with him to the site as they broke into mutters. He heard several mentions of the absent students' names, worrying over their well-being and relief that most of them were okay. Shota hoped with his entire soul that his students wouldn't be forced to pull 2 bodies out of the rubble. Katsuki was digging. He kept half an ear out to make sure Deku was still breathing. The nerd was so loud it was easy. Since he passed out, he had been louder somehow. It spoke to just how determined not to be a nuisance he was when he was awake. Something bitter settled in his stomach, and he took it out on a chunk of wall. It was impossible. He was digging, but doing so in pitch blackness was fated to fail. He couldn't tell which rocks were safe to move. He had to feel over the whole pile of debris to make sure a rock wasn't keeping the entire place stable or something, and then move it. He had made a bit of progress, but nothing significant. The frequent breaks he had to take to check on Deku helped ensure that he got nowhere. He hated to admit it, but he was beginning to feel exhausted. His breaths came in struggling, thick gasps due to the increasing loss of oxygen. His throat was parched and full of dust, and he was carved out with a hollow sort of hunger. The last time he had eaten and drank was breakfast, and that was who knew how long ago. They had to have been stuck there for nearly a day by now. It sure felt that long. Every second had been torture, darkness, the sound of thunder and rocks, and Deku in pain. Katsuki paused and in the darkness turned his head back in the direction of where Deku was lying. He didn't know how much longer the nerd would be able to hold out. Deku's injury was nasty, very nasty. The rebar was rusty and filthy, and there was no way the wound wasn't heavily infected by now. Katsuki was under no illusions. That rebar was probably the only thing keeping Deku alive, despite the pain it must be causing him. If it was taken out, Deku would bleed to death in minutes. Even with the peripheral thought of pain, his own injuries throbbed mockingly. He had told Deku he was fine, but he suspected he had broken a few of his ribs, and his wrist was also definitely broken and needed a splint. More reason why digging them out wasn't going so well. The increasing pressure from loss of air made them pound and throb. He grit his teeth and endured it, turning back to his wall of rubble. They didn't have time. Kartsky needed to get them out of here fast, somehow. He was beginning to feel dizzy and sick, and his gasps were heavy and matched Deku's in their volume. Beyond the exhaustion, he knew what that meant. They were running out of air. Kartsky took in a shallow breath and let it out slowly. The thought. He hated it. He couldn't do fucking anything against suffocating. He could try his best to dig them out, he could wrap Deku's wounds and keep tags on him, but he was helpless against suffocation. In a few hours, maybe even less, he and Deku would die, choking on their own breath in endless darkness and silence. If Kartsky couldn't make a dent in this stupid tunnel that was. He panted. He should probably check on Deku again. Leaving his useless endeavour for now, Kartsky shakily stood up as much as he was able. He was left in a half-crouch. It killed him, being unable to stretch out his legs. He annoyedly got back down onto his hands and knees and shuffled carefully over. He knew the way pretty well by now, having learned early on from scrapes and bumps where to avoid. Gravity crushed down on him, making the small distance seem like kilometers and kilometers away. He felt something springy and rubbery softly press against his forearm, the sole of one of Deku's stupid red runners. Kartsky put a hand on it to get his bearings. Was this what it was like being blind? He felt up Deku's cold leg to his torso. The nerd kept breathing raggedly, sounding breathy and in pain. When he reached his torso, he stopped. He didn't want to accidentally move the rebar again. Speaking of that, Kartsky was hesitant to use his explosions. If he wasn't careful, he could easily cause a collapse or choke them both with smoke, not to mention they ate up the oxygen. But he thought he needed to. He needed to check that Deku wasn't bleeding through his makeshift wrap again. He had already had to change it a few times. Once or twice while Deku was conscious, and once again while he was unconscious. It was worrying. Deku needed actual bandages and actual help. Kartsky was freezing and filthy, but he knew Deku could use his shirt more than him. He had carefully ripped it up into strips, and he had a few fresh ones left, which he had tied around his arm for safekeeping. He paused for a second. Then, reluctantly, he held out his palms a safe distance from both of them. He braced himself. He needed to use the second of visibility wisely, and set off a weak explosion. Light blinding and brilliant filled the area. It hurt his throbbing head, but Kartsky kept his eyes open and kept staring at the spot he knew Deku was lying. In the brief flash, Kartsky took in as much as he could. Deku was sickly pale, sweat matting down his hair and covering his face. His ragged breathing hitched at the flash of light, and he let out a slight groan. Kartsky's eyes quickly flickered to the injury. It was as gory as ever. Most of the bottom half of Deku's shirt was ruined, soaked completely in a deep red. The area around the injury itself was worse, bits of dirt and gravel having gotten stuck in the shirt and adding an awful texture to the sight. Fresh blood glinted in the light as Deku's breath hitched, and a bit of fresh wine red welled up through Kartsky's ripped shirt. It would need to be changed again. Not good. The light was gone as quickly as it had been there, and Kartsky coughed a few more times from the residual smoke. He stared into the thick void once more, everything invisible to him. He knew what he had to do. He hated changing Deku's wrap, The sounds the nerd made were pathetic and weak, and it made his hand shake, which just made him more likely to screw up. Blood pounded in his ears, the pressure from lack of air making his headache throb, and paired with his dizziness, he was dreading it. Despite this, he kept one hand on Deku's torso and carefully untied a strip of shirt from his arm. It was a delicate process, especially with no light at all, but he had done it enough times to be able to fare reasonably well by feel. He felt around to remove the blood-soaked strip without touching the rebar and replaced it with the new one, tying it tightly. Deku whimpered. A stab of guilt hit Katsuki in the chest, and his own breath hitched. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about the conversation they last had. When Deku was delirious with pain and exhaustion, he wasn't sure he would have been able to have it if he wasn't. Everything he had said. He had been thinking about it a lot before. Back at the school, the anger management and therapy he had been taking with Hound Dog had taught him to acknowledge and approach it healthily. Being friends with Shitty Hair and the others, watching Deku with his own friends, and then watching Deku's reactions to him. It had been a slow, gradual, jarring realization that maybe his own behavior was the problem. Being at a not shitty school and surrounded by people who didn't worship him and his quirk and didn't put up with his shit helped a lot. It put things into perspective. He wasn't much for admitting he was wrong, but he was trying. It was hard. He knew he had done and said some fucked up things to Deku in middle school, when Deku had done nothing to deserve it. He could say he was sorry all he wanted, but he was a coward for only having the guts for it when Deku probably wouldn't remember it afterwards. It was actions that mattered. Actions like not yelling at him and not using his quirk on him and replacing the blood-soaked shirt around his wound. Katsuki discarded the soaked makeshift bandage, wincing as it made a wet sound when it landed. One day, Katsuki would get the nerve to say it to Deku when they were both paying proper attention. After a few more seconds, Deku's breathing evened back out. It was still ragged, but not erratic anymore. Katsuki leaned over and carefully managed to feel around until he came into contact with the clammy skin of Deku's throat. He moved his hand up and felt it flat against the side of his neck to get a feel for his pulse. It was fast, too fast and thready. Deku's skin was cold and sweaty, and he was trembling slightly. Katsuki jerked his hand off. His stomach did a somersault. That wasn't good. Katsuki needed to get Deku help now. They had done victims in class. He knew that heart rate got weaker and faster the closer to death someone was. His eyes were wide in the dark as his mind went over his options several times. Blast a hole in the tunnel and hope it didn't kill Deku? No. Keep digging? Too slow. Sit on his ass and wait to be rescued? Ugh. That was it. Their lives hung on 3 factors. He knew there would be rescue teams out by now, but he also knew they didn't have long. Deku's breaths were scary, and he himself was struggling to take in air. It was thick and old with dust and clogged up his airways. His head spun and throbbed. He didn't have a choice. He didn't have time to wait to get rescued or for him to dig them out. Deku didn't have time. Either he risks killing Deku by blasting himself out of the hole and looking for help, or Deku dies anyway. And Katsuki has to sit in this hole with Deku's rotting body while he slowly suffocates. He shuffled over to the other end of the tunnel, where there was the lowest risk of the roof caving in on Deku. He took in a breath, as deep as he dared. Katsuki's hands trembled. His head pounded and pounded and pounded. Sorry, nerd, he whispered into the darkness. Kartsky's palms sparked. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate all the support you've given me. I knew it was too good to be true. Bakugo is hurt. At least their classmates are being called in, but will it be too late? Will Bakugo be able to get them out, or will his last-ditch attempt kill them both? We'll just have to wait and see. I decided that for the second year in a row, I'm going to do the memory walk for Alzheimer's Society, which I'm really excited about, but I guess it's unfortunate that it's so close to home for me. I'm going to do my best though. All credits go to the original creator of this fanfiction, Silverheart SP on AO3. I'd highly appreciate it if you gave this video a like and you subscribe to the channel and you hit the notification bell to be notified of when I next upload. There is no pressure to do so though. Thank you for visiting my cozy corner of the internet. Keep growing my sunflowers. Mwah!